I don't even really know where to begin. The school to prison pipeline, wherein black and brown children are disciplined much more harshly than white children, like across the board. There is like the militarization of the police and the specific targeting of black and brown bodies by police officers.
Essentially, you have this entire economy that was built on black labor that completely disintegrated, and yet there's been no channels for black people to actually become a part of society.
So when you think about, decades of failed housing policies and chronic low-performing educational institutions, chronic unemployment and underemployment, poor health care, and then you throw in guns and you throw in drugs, this culture of violence was fomented.
And I think racism, that was how this country was founded. So it's no surprise that it's systemically being used to oppress people of color, specifically black people.
There's a view, presupposition of violence, that there's a feeling that these folks are going to hurt somebody. There's something innate about them being more violent.
Black bodies have definitely been oppressed systematically. But even today, we see institutionalized racism in schools, in jails. That's why so many of us are filled up in them. You don't really have racism unless it's systematic, because racism is more about power. It's a power structure, and it fuels things. So it's not about someone calling me the N-word or anything like that. I mean, that's bad. But it's less about people and more about systems and how they affect people on a mass scale and over time as well.
You still can be disregarded. You still will face microaggressions. You still will have to worry about your children on a day-to-day basis. Even though you can occupy this area, you still aren't necessarily belonging there.
We can no longer stand idly by and ignore the fact that black people, women and men, Latino women and men, are disproportionately in violent incidents with the police. And too often they lead to death.
Black people being free in this country is a fairly new thing, really, and we're still working towards that. If we're talking about 200 years ago when slavery was so long ago, it actually wasn't, because we're feeling those retentions. We're feeling the heat from that now, and I don't think it's going to go away for a while.
There is a reluctance in America, I think, to talk bluntly about race, and I think part of it is because, to be frank, we have a very shameful racial history in America. Part of the dominant narrative has been, but we've progressed as a society. We had the civil rights movement, we had Martin Luther King, and now we can all live equally and everyone has equal opportunity. And that's a nice idea, but it's simply factually inaccurate. And so even though there's no whites only and blacks only, etc. signs on things anymore, we still live in a deeply unequal country.
As a black individual in America, you feel something, and again, it's hard to measure, but you feel something. You feel that something's wrong. You feel that you're being discriminated against. You feel this otherness about yourself. Our bodies have always been in a shape and in a form, right, in a morphology that's like, you're criminal, you're to be feared, you're ugly, and that's not good.
Because when we talk about poor people, we are generally talking about people of color. And not always, but in general, when we talk about inner city communities. And then there are some inherent biases that people have. But when we talk about race, to ignore it is to do it at your own peril.
Black children are made to seem like they are older and more powerful than they are. According to Darren Wilson, Mike Brown was like 300 pounds and hulking. He was like the Hulk. Mike Brown was 18 years old. Tamir Rice was 12. What the fuck happened to Sandra Bland? Seriously, why is she dead? Why did she get pulled over? Why did she get killed without anybody looking really into it and nobody being prosecuted because she was black? I think that when people in the white mainstream culture see a black kid, they're like, that's a thug. And thug is basically the 2015 term for nigger. I just don't understand. White people I don't understand how you could think that racism doesn't exist, but that's the way that whiteness is upheld and perpetuated.
Even the Boston Police Department is not without its warts and without its problems, and frankly, without knuckleheads on the force. And unfortunately, those knuckleheads have a disproportionate effect upon the point of view that the public has, at least people of color have, around the police. If there's any lessons to be taught by that, is that suppression tactics alone do not work. When the response of the state is more cops and more suppression, then it's a cycle that continues to repeat itself. So breaking that cycle becomes critical if we're going to last as a society.
In terms of mainstream culture, and specifically white mainstream culture, there is an unapologetic undercurrent of white people who are just afraid of black men, and specifically black teenagers.
We're seeing so many images, and that really messes with the black psyche. That makes you not feel confident about yourself. That makes you feel scared.
It's traumatizing, to hear gunfire on a regular basis. You hear about that a lot in wars, when you go overseas, it happens in the inner city communities on a daily basis. They're also living every day in this culture of violence. It's been my experience that some of the most intelligent and creative and wise people that I've ever met have been out on the street. For most people, bad police relationships stem from what officers do every day and how officers treat people every day.
The media is a microcosm, right? It's a small part of a larger system, larger cultural constructions, larger ideologies, right? And journalists, just like all of us, have biases. They're raised. It's like, the story of the fish who doesn't know what water is because they live in water. And all of us live in a society that fundamentally was built around ideologies of things like white supremacy, like things like patriarchy. There's assumptions about what power the state should and shouldn't have in our lives that we sort of are raised within and that we don't ever question, that we don't even ever think about. Often the news doesn't pay attention to these communities until something like what happened in Baltimore happens. And so you don't get the story about sort of the lived trauma and the psychological tolls of things like poverty, of things like being profiled, of people feeling unsafe in their own communities because of feeling like they're not valued by their government, they're not valued by the police. You don't get those background stories. Instead, you see the moment in which there's some sort of eruption that causes conflict, and that's when oftentimes the sort of cameras swoop in and the journalists swoop in with the microphones.
There are many people in this world today who will say to you that racism exists because black people keep on bringing it up. But we don't speak about it, so that means we're not dealing with it.
Everyone's kind of at this different spectrum of knowledge around race and identity. So everyone kind of comes into the spectrum at a different point. And you'll have people who are very, very aware of other cultures, and then you'll have people who've grown up in a predominantly white place their entire life, who really only know about black people from what they've seen on TV, who just don't really understand the struggles that individuals face.
In a day and age where so many folks in particular try to make people feel comfortable, where so many folks are unwilling to talk about the issues of race and the fact that hell yeah, racism still exists, and it's in a more virulent form nowadays. And I love it. Doesn't matter whether you're black, brown, yellow, purple always comes in there somewhere. I don't know why that one always comes in there. But when it comes down to it, it does matter and it does affect our lives. And if you choose to not hear our voice, then you're saying that our voice doesn't matter. And that's not okay.
Not to say to folks, this is not a racial issue, as was said in some other cities, with some other police officials, right? But to say this is an issue that we all have to engage in, and we as police officers also have to engage in it.
When someone says, I don't see color, it's just like, dang, you don't see my oppression, you don't see my disadvantages. And I think it's very important for white people to see that, because again, they have white privilege. Not only that, they have dominion, right? Really, over the planet, really, and that's just facts. The fact that you can say you don't see color, that is a privilege in and of itself. You're portraying your privilege by saying that.
Even though you don't see color, the rest of society does see color, and that's a very, very idealistic mindset to have. Even though with that mindset, no growth and no forward movement or change will be able to occur.
The worst thing about white people who don't see race is that they think that they are doing a positive service to society by not seeing race. And what they don't realize is that by not seeing race, they are refusing to see racial injustice and or race-based injustice. They are refusing to acknowledge the history that they have perpetuated of committing violent acts against not only other white people, but people of color. And that's at best ignorant and at worst extremely violent and invalidating to the experiences of people of color who have to deal with racial injustice on a daily basis. And I actually don't see people who don't see color. So I don't I don't engage.
It's just so much more than discrimination. It's so much more than being killed on the street. It's happening on a mass scale. That's the problem, right? So it's not like you have isolated events. These things are happening systematically.
But I think that teaching is always important, especially if you feel like that person will be receptive to learning. And I think that's the only way that any racial progression will happen. However, teaching is incredibly draining, and it's not like teaching any type of external concept. It's an incredibly personal thing that you're kind of sharing with this person, even though it's still seen as very topical.
The best lie I was ever told is that your voice doesn't mean anything. You can't fight City Hall, you can't fight the State House, you can't fight the power, you can't fight the man. They all want you to believe that. Martin Luther King died at 39. All of the stuff that he did in his life happened in under 40 years.
Sometimes I think when people try to compare the current moment to the past, they're comparing it to a very sanitized and mythical past that never really existed. And so it's hard, obviously, to compare the present moment because we're living in it.
It's 50 years later and we're still talking about the same things. We're still feeling the same way. Young people are rising up again. It's just these waves of activism. I think when Ferguson happened, everyone was like, quit my job and go to Ferguson. But we were like, we're going to quit our job like I did. I quit my job and I stayed in my own community and said, where do y'all need me? Put me where you need me. How can I help? Let's create strategies around that because Ferguson is Boston. Ferguson is America. Like, this is happening everywhere in the country. That's why there's so many Black revolutions on campus right now, because there's nothing in the history of any school where Black students or students of color were just given, what they needed. They had to ask for it or demand it.
Even among millennials, right, among college students now, it's like, well, a lot of you only remember there being a Black president, and that's cool and that's significant and that shows how far our country has come. But if your elders are telling you, and that means there's no racism, and yet on a daily basis you still experience racial inequality, you still see the differences in how people are treated, it becomes this really hard thing to sort of wrap your mind around. Young people are being told that everything is okay when we know that everything's not okay, and they can see that.
A lot of students are having these same concerns and same hurdles, and it's this almost national solidarity around race in a college campus. And it also has this huge, huge national push because it's kind of fueled with the Black Lives Matter movement. These two things are going on simultaneously. So you have one campaign that's mostly disproportionately affecting lower income areas, and you have this another entirely different campaign mostly affecting just Black middle class. And I think that's a very interesting solidarity within classes within the African American community too.
But by the time Mike Brown happened, I was really mad. I was extremely angry. I was very upset. And I finally was like, this pertains to me. This is me. Yeah. It was like righteous anger. It just made me feel sad and angry and powerful and depressed and hopeful at the same time. Like, it was a really weird experience.
What they're asking for is societal change. And there are some folks who sort of are taken aback with that, but I always felt that the work that I have done for the past 25 years was really to help, nurture and help to generate the movement that is now happening among our young people. because the issue of violence, it really is about lives mattering, And when we say Black Lives Matter, it's because there have been so many people who have operated as if Black lives did not matter.
No one else is going to make changes for your community. And I think that's a part of history that we don't get. It's that it wasn't Martin and Malcolm that, made the big changes. Absolutely, we admire them. They were brilliant. They, were movers and shakers. But it was the poor, dispossessed, and everyday people in Black communities that actually made changes for themselves. Mm-hmm. Without the organizers on the ground, none of our liberation would have came to this point. None of the legislation, none of that would have happened without regular people fighting on their own behalf. I think it's very important to understand that even when we're working with the law and we're working with public policy, to understand that media is the language of the day.
New media spaces and online activism can very much influence the news agenda of the mainstream news, but they still can't control how mainstream newsmakers use sort of more traditional news values to frame what they're saying in those social media spaces. And we saw maybe even a more optimistic example of that when Ferguson happened. And so we know from our research that the very first people actually tweeting about Ferguson and using the Ferguson hashtag were people, not even activists, just everyday people who were friends of Michael Brown or lived in his community, were young people, were on the street, saw his body, took a photo, and people began tweeting about it. And there was so much emotion and outrage in their tweets that people began retweeting them and other people began tweeting about it, and then sort of like famous people began, we can trace sort of how that spread through networks online before even the first mainstream news story at the local level happens.
I had like a lot of actually kind of aggressive Facebook posts where I was like, you know what, like we live in a white supremacist dystopia and Black Lives Matter. And America is racist, and this is about the liberation of Black and brown folks. And it made me feel like a very intense solidarity towards marginalized peoples that I never allowed myself to engage with before.
I think that it just gives this visibility that's just unable to be given or just hasn't been given to Black populations in the past. I mean, that's the same reason why police brutality has been as visible as it is this year. With the positives and negatives within that. It's able to pick up attention from major media outlets. It's able to kind of get this progression that issues have never really been able to get before. And it's a very, very grassroots model too at the same time.
What are you going to do to make a difference? Are you going to let people tell you that your generation doesn't stand for anything? I'm amped by Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, University of Missouri. Those are just amazing things that should happen. And young people should be impatient, and they should organize, and you should force us. Not ask us, but you should force us to change.
A really good place to start is a common understanding of sort of the historical conditions and the values and sort of ideologies that are crux of the culture and the country that we all live in. But I also think it's very important for people who care deeply about these issues to have interpersonal conversations.
I think that white people should listen to the struggles and concerns of people of color and reiterate those struggles and concerns to other white people and brainstorm ways to support. And when it comes to white people interacting with people of color, I think that they should shut the fuck up.
For I think people have dominant identities, and I would say this across any issue, not just race, it's really important to sit back and hear the experiences with empathy of those who don't have dominant identities. I think empathy is so crucial, because particularly when we talk about experiences with inequality, when you haven't had those experiences, it's easy to believe those things don't exist because you don't know how it feels.
We have to not check our biases at the door. We have to embrace them, understand them, and understand how we move from that point to a point of greater understanding. We can do that, but all of the things that I'm talking about require work, it requires effort, and it requires resources. When it comes down to the issue of race, yes, it matters. And if there's anyone out there who wants to fix it, wants to change it, we need advocates not only who are people of color, but we need white advocates to go to their Thanksgiving table. Have conversations with your that uncle who says that stuff. Have conversations with your mama and your dad. Have those conversations that mean something.
We should always remember that there are people who have investments in things the way they are. And the more you push, the more they resist. So as we push for change, we ought to also push for a greater understanding of humanity.